So a very warm welcome to this evening's Justice for Palestinians webinar. My name is Andy Smith. I'm co-coordinator for the local group. It won't have escaped your notice that there was an election in Israel last week, fourth or fifth in the last year. It's been crazy. It makes changes in British prime ministers look positively glacial by comparison. But the results were, I think, from most independent observers' point of view, fairly grim in that Benjamin Netanyahu looks like having to go into coalition with some outright racist parties, which is grim even by Israeli standards. But we're delighted to have with us this evening Danielle Bett, who's the communications director for Yachad, which is a British Jewish organization with a firm belief in a just solution, so a safe and secure Israel alongside a safe and secure Palestinian state. She was previously Scottish Director for the Jewish Leadership Council and is coming to us tonight from Tel Aviv. She's a Scottish Israeli, as you'll hear, and we're delighted to have you join us, Danielle. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you. So for those joining a little late, we've got about 20 minutes. Danielle's going to talk to us about Yachad's view on the election results, and then we'll go into Q&A for another 20 minutes or so. We'll have a hard stop at 7 because it's the birthday of two of our wives at least. So forgive us for making a prompt close, but we encourage you to ask questions using the chat function, or raise your hand at the end of Danielle's talk, and we'll allow you to unmute and ask it in your own voice. Thanks very much. Over to you, Danielle.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. As Andy said, I'm Scottish Israeli, therefore I have an odd accent, so bear with. Just quickly on Yachad, for those who aren't familiar, we're a British Jewish organization. Our primary mission is really to work with the Jewish community and to empower British Jews in supporting a political resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. To us, that is some form of a two-state solution. We believe in Israel's right to exist. We believe in Palestine's right to exist. Our focus is on advocating for resolution. We believe that political resolution is the only way that Israel will thrive alongside a viable Palestinian state. We're a pretty significant voice in the mainstream Jewish community, quite a challenging voice, but we are kind of members of the Board of Deputies. We engage with the mainstream community. We have thousands of supporters in the community, a lot of students that we work with, and we work with lots of communal bodies, and we also work with the British Parliament cross-party. So I'm here to talk about the Israeli election. I just thought I would do a quick review of how Israeli elections work. So Israel uses a proportional representation system, the list system. So voters don't vote for a politician or a county, they vote for a party. The threshold in order for any party to make it into the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, is 3.25%. So if a party gets, so that's around 4 seats out of 120 seats, you don't need to worry about the numbers. So when voters vote, if a party gets 10% of the vote, it gets 12 of the 120 seats in the Knesset. The minimum seats are 4 for a party to be a member of the Knesset. The reason that's important is because this year, for example, around 40 parties ran in the election. Less than 15 got in, and so that means that if you vote for a party that doesn't make it into the threshold, doesn't cross the 3.25%, your vote isn't counted. It doesn't go anywhere, and that's really important because it means lots of people vote for small parties, and those parties don't make it through, and their votes are kind of wasted. And so often people are encouraged to vote for the bigger parties, but also often one might say that it's a way of weakening the kind of more fringe opinions or more fringe parties. So if we've got 120 seats in the Knesset, you need 61 to have a majority. And that is, Bibi has crossed that threshold, and we would think it seems to have been crossed by the 4 major right-wing parties, making up a total of 61. No single party can form a government. Israel will always have coalitions. The biggest party is Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud. They usually get between 25 to 30% of the vote, so they will always still need to form a coalition with other parties in order to cross the 50% threshold to form a government. I'm sure you're aware that we had 1 year without Benjamin Netanyahu, a break, one might say, a government that was termed the change government, led by Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid. That government failed. It was a cross-party coalition of 7 parties, very diverse, still quite controversial to many, lasted, like I said, for 1 year. And that's how we ended up in our 5th election in 3 years. So before I go into the kind of results, so I'll make a disclaimer, which is I can't speak on behalf of Palestinians. I can kind of share the voices of the Palestinians that I've spoken to, or the voices that I've read and heard, but I'm Israeli. I don't speak on behalf of Palestinians. And the other thing I would say is that I would urge you, when looking at Israeli politics, to try and detach yourself from looking at it through a British lens, and to try and look at this to understand that this is not a European political system. It's not a European culture. It's not a European society. Even though Israel likes to portray itself as the only democracy in the Middle East and high-tech nation and all these things, that's true. But this is very much still a Middle Eastern environment, and the kind of party spectrum isn't the standard right-wing, left-wing that you would expect, which is usually measured through economic issues, attitudes to migrants, etc. There are more complex issues, like especially faith, that have an influence on the way in which the Israeli political spectrum sits. That being said, so on the 1st of November, we had our elections. Netanyahu's party came out as the kind of winner, and he's now in the progress of forming his coalition. The likely coalition, as in the parties in which he is currently in negotiation with, is obviously his own party, the Likud. It's a right-wing party, although in this current coalition, it will be the most left-wing party, which is quite concerning. Just a few things on Netanyahu and Likud. He is still facing corruption charges, and his trial is ongoing. His supporter base is very, very strong. He both as a politician, but like his party has support, but his base is very much around his cult of personality and who Bibi is. He's seen as this kind of great leader. Most of that obviously is due to populism and long years of campaigning, but a lot of the voters for Likud are Netanyahu-specific voters. It's not even a left-wing, right-wing thing. His campaign over the past year, and especially around this election, focused on calling on his existing supporters to bring friends and family to come out and vote. It was quite smart in that sense. It was not trying to gain new supporters, but encourage existing supporters to call on people to vote. I think it was very successful. He has gained some seats in this election, and also the voting percentage has gone up, which might not just be due to Netanyahu. It could be other reasons, but I think that's worth noting. And his campaign is, as you would expect, very populist, calling Yair Lapid, our previous prime minister, or technically current prime minister, kind of calling on his partnership with Arab and Palestinians parties, pointing to it in a very racist way, tying them to terrorism, tying them to the Muslim Brotherhood, tying them to a danger to Israeli security. And also the kind of general populism you would expect from a strong right-wing leader. Netanyahu likes to attack the media. He will avoid being interviewed on most Israeli mainstream media channels or newspapers. And another element to this campaign, and also the past year in Israel, is it's not just been a Palestinian-Israeli issue, but a lot of it is around what defines being Jewish and who is the right representative for Jewish people. And so often Lapid has been attacked as kind of not Jewish enough, not connected enough to his faith, a traitor to Jewish people sometimes even. And I think that's a very major narrative that you don't hear often in the UK and abroad, which has been very, very prominent in this election. I'll get to the far right in a moment, but the other two partners in the upcoming government are Shas and Yadut Torah. I'm grouping them together because they are both conservative religious parties. They represent Haredi, which is very ultra-Orthodox. I don't know if I'm kind of over-explaining, but I don't know how familiar people are with Jewish terms. they are both ultra-Orthodox religious parties. And so you would kind of classically put them in the right wing. They're very socially conservative. They won't support on LGBTQ issues. They don't really have a huge campaign on Palestinian issues, but they're not exactly going to be Palestinian friendly. But their main issue is around their own conservative communities, around keeping the Sabbath and preventing public transport on Sabbath, on controlling education budgets. And some of their policies are also, and this is why I say it's not classical right-left, some of these parties' policies are very socially, they're very socialist. They're very much about helping poor communities, as the Orthodox religious communities suffer from poverty. Them and Arab communities are the two poorest communities in Israel. So we are at 3. We have Likud and those 2 Haredi parties, Shas and Yadut Torah. And then last, but certainly not least, the party that we're all most concerned about is the Religious Zionist Party, which I'm sure you've all heard of. So the Religious Zionist Party is a far-right party, for all intents and purposes. It's a party that is made of 3 small parties. It did not, therefore, as I mentioned with the threshold issue before, those 3 small parties weren't very prominent in Israeli politics until 2019-20. They didn't pass the threshold, essentially, and were kind of far-right voices on the fringes of Israeli politics. Around 2019-2020, Netanyahu realized that those wasted votes that weren't crossing the threshold could help him, because those are right-wing parties, and right-wing parties are going to support him in forming any government. And so he agreed a deal between the 3 smaller parties, far-right parties, and united them under the umbrella of the Religious Zionist Party. And that's how we've come to where we are today. Thank you, Benjamin Netanyahu. So I do want to just go into the 3 separate parties. So the first one is the biggest party, the Religious Zionist Party, led by Bezalel Smotrich. He is a Jewish supremacist. He is pro-settlement expansion. He is socially very conservative, in favor of annexing Area C of the West Bank, and opposes same-sex marriage, although he's trying to distance himself from dealing with LGBTQ issues. He's also made some very concerning comments about statistics on violence against women, et cetera, et cetera. And he is the kind of leader of the 3 overall. The second is Otzma Yehudit, translated into Jewish Power, led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, who again, I'm sure you've all heard of. It is a Kahanist far-right party. It's a descendant of a party that was called Kach, which was outlawed actually by the Israeli Knesset. And so this is its kind of legacy party. This party has advocated for deporting the enemies of Israel to Syria. This is very much a Ben-Gvir campaign. Deport enemies of Israel to Syria. Who are enemies of Israel and how do we deport them? We don't quite know, but it's basically, often he talks about Arab Palestinian MKs, members of Knesset, and politicians, so Israeli politicians who are far left, as enemies. I don't think he's actually going to deport them. I think it's just the nature of a very populist racist campaign. Itamar Ben-Gvir doesn't believe in Palestinian statehood, of course. Furthermore, he doesn't believe in there being citizenship granted to Palestinians. He kind of suggests a full annexation with Palestinians as second-class citizens who can't vote. So there he is, the most concerning of the leaders. And third, smallest amount of power goes to Noam, which is again, far-right party, which mainly focuses on anti-LGBTQ family values, they say, very similar to right-wing Christian conservatives in America, but their focus is on opposing LGBTQ rights. So those are our 3 wonderful far-right leaders who have kind of united for the Religious Zionist Party. They are currently the 3rd biggest party in Israeli politics, which is extremely concerning. I'll get into why in a little bit. I think it's worth noting that both Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, the two of the leaders, are going to be ministers. This was agreed before the election. Netanyahu guaranteed, in order to keep them kind of on side, that they would get ministerial positions, which is very concerning. The question is obviously what ministerial positions they have. And we know that Itamar Ben-Gvir is hoping to be Minister for Interior Security, which would be incredibly concerning. That means that he will have control of the police and that he will likely support violent settlers, etc. But we don't know yet. That's still to all be confirmed. He did not serve in the Israeli army, Itamar Ben-Gvir, because he was tied to extremist organizations in his youth, and he was not allowed to serve in the army. So we really are talking about a violent extremist. Bezalel Smotrich comes across as a little bit more tame, but isn't by far. He was also arrested by Israeli security services in 2005 for allegedly planning an attack in response to the Israel's disengagement from Gaza, found with hundreds of liters of gasoline, him and a few friends. He wasn't charged, but he was held for 3 weeks by the Israeli security services. So we're talking about very, very dangerous people who are now going to be in control of Israeli politics, or at least have a very major role to play in Israeli politics. From the Palestinian point of view, overall, their dialogue and narrative has been encouraging Arabs to emigrate, annexation. And they talk about imposing the death penalty for terrorists, although again, who defines terrorism? The death penalty, needless to say, hasn't existed in Israel for years. Ben-Gvir promotes using live fire against Palestinian protesters and stone throwers. Again, how do you impose a law that allows a soldier to shoot, or a police person to shoot against Palestinians and not Jews? I don't know. But these are real questions, and whilst a lot of people are saying, it's not going to be the end of days, that's probably true. We are looking at an extreme government that is going to probably try and move Israel back on the things that it has managed to progress on, and move Israel forward in expanding settlements, preventing a two-state solution from becoming a reality, et cetera, et cetera. I just want to touch quickly on why I think these parties have won. So I think first and foremost, in the way that in the left and also in the dialogue abroad, we talk about Israel-Palestine, that conversation isn't happening much here. It's more the conversation around security issues. So the average is really worried about security, and especially settlers, and think of the fact that we have almost 1 million settlers now. They do experience violence, etc. There's a bigger picture to be looked at, but the day-to-day life of people is affected by violence as a result of occupation. And so people are concerned about their security. And when populist campaign consistently hammers home that the enemies of Israel might enter the government, i.e. Palestinians and Arabs, and that they will be rough on terror and all these things, as you've seen in America and other countries, populism works. Playing on people's fears tends to work, and it will get people who don't usually vote. And I think that's what's happened with the Religious Zionist Party. It gets people who don't usually vote to come out and vote. Notably, a lot of the supporters of Itamar Ben-Gvir in particular are young religious men, or young men in general. I think also, as I said, this is not just an election that's centered around Israel-Palestine. We have a very divided society in Israel. That's why we've also seen votes go up for Shas, the religious Orthodox Conservative Party, who represent social conservative and the lack of separation of church and state, or church and synagogue. A lot of the internal dialogue in Israel isn't, again, around security. It's around issues like public transport on a Saturday, which Israel doesn't currently have because of the Sabbath being kept. It's around issues on education budgets, and the education for religious schools being higher or lower than the education for secular schools, or what a secular education takes place in religious schools. So, for example, a lot of religious people won't believe that mathematics should be taught in religious schools because they don't need it. They just need to learn religious studies. But then that has a long-standing effect on how religious people can integrate into the economy. And those are the kind of conversations that are being had between secular and religious or conservative Jews in Israel. And that has been very much played upon by a lot of politicians. And that divide is very, very much sensed. That's why Yachad, Yair Lapid's party, is far bigger than Bibi's Likud in Tel Aviv, which is a more secular liberal city. And then last but not least, we do have the weakness of the left. We have a very divided left in Israel, often undefined. On the one hand, they want to be popular amongst the kind of general working class public, but also don't quite know how to approach the issue of Israel-Palestine. Very sadly, one of the outcomes of this election has been that Meretz, one of our kind of a very friendly party towards organizations like Yachad. Meretz is a left-wing socialist liberal party that very strongly advocates for Palestinian human rights. They did not cross the threshold for the first time since their founding, and they will not be in the Knesset at all. Even though they would sit as an opposition party, it's a huge loss to not have a Jewish party Arab Partnership Party that advocates for Palestinian rights. So their loss will certainly be felt, and they didn't make it into the parliament. And similarly, Israel's Labour Party has also reduced significantly its power in the Knesset. So both the kind of left-wing parties have gone down in their support. Yair Lapid's Yachad party has gone up as a centrist or center-left party. And I think that's partially because people who would classically vote for the left voted for a bigger party, as they believed that the most important thing in this election was to keep Netanyahu out and to keep the far right out. And probably failed in doing that. But it is important to say that overall in these elections, even though Netanyahu has a majority, when you look at the stats for how and where people voted, it's around 49 to 51%, maybe 48 to 52. There's not a huge difference in the people who voted for the right-wing parties and for the kind of center to left parties and Arab and Palestinian parties. Like I said, I'm not Palestinian, so I don't claim to speak from a Palestinian perspective. I think for what I know from Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, from their point of view, there's not much difference. The last government, we saw an increase in settler violence. We saw an increase in settler settlement being built. There wasn't a massive sense of easing of border crossings or anything else that would affect Palestinian day-to-day life. It's difficult to compare because it only was a year, but I think I can understand how, from a Palestinian perspective, what difference does it make really? From the perspective of Palestinians in Israel or Arab Israelis, it's a little bit different because now there is a far-right party in power that is outwardly against them and has advocated very much in avoiding having Palestinian voices in the Israeli parliament. And so there's a difference also in that between the people within the Green Line and the Palestinians in Palestine, how their lives are affected. And especially because in the last year, we have seen more budgets go to Arab communities, more attempts to tackle issues like crime, which is a big issue within the Green Line for Arabs in Israel, and things like that. And that's definitely missing. So I think I will stop in my ramble there and maybe allow for questions, because I think, maybe that's helpful.
Thanks very much, Danielle. That's absolutely fascinating insight into the situation. I was really interested in what you were saying about Israel having to look at Israeli politics through different eyes. Don't put a European lens on it. That was very interesting. And just a couple of questions while people are typing theirs into the chat box or raising a hand to indicate that they'd like to ask something. If you'd like to turn your cameras on, audience, you're very welcome to do so now. I may have turned a few of yours off, so if you find you can't turn yours back on, let me know and I'll bring you back on. But just wondering about turnout, because the fifth election in 3 years, and you mentioned that the far right mobilized a few communities that perhaps in the past hadn't voted. I'm just wondering, was the turnout higher this time, or are people fed up with endless elections and therefore not turning out? Or are they all? Yeah, what's the level of participation?
So surprisingly, the turnout was actually higher this year than last time. It was around 70%, which is 2 to 3% higher than the last election in 2020. One of the biggest concerns, especially on the left, was that there would be a low Arab voter turnout, but actually it was pretty consistent with the usual numbers. It didn't go up or down. There was a split between the Arab parties on the left, which some say might have had an impact in encouraging people to keep coming out and vote. So the Arab voter turnout is around 50%. I need to check the exact numbers. So it is certainly lower, but overall the voting percentage was actually high. I think people did feel like this was a high stakes election. Just unfortunately, from my perspective, clearly not enough people came out to vote for the more tame parties, shall we say.
Thanks very much. I can see Adrian Libanov has his hand up to ask a question. Would you like to unmute and ask away? Adrian.
Thanks. Oh. Thanks, Andy. We often hear about the weakness of the left in Israel, and I just wondered if you had any views on whether we could do anything to help support the left in Israel.
Thank you. I have a few views on that. Yeah, so I think within the UK, it's very important to not speak over or speak for people on the ground in Israel and Palestine. I think as much as possible to empower the organizations that are doing the work. There are so many great human rights organizations in Israel. The reason I'm focusing on Israel is because ultimately the balance of power when you look at the occupation does lie within Israel. And so Israel is the strongest player of the two parties, of the two sides. So I think, first of all, as much as you can uplift the voices of Israelis and Palestinians putting in the work day to day, as much as possible, avoid transporting this conflict into local politics. So often it seems to be like people think that the conservatives have to be pro-Israel and that Labour have to be pro-Palestine, and it's this odd left-wing, right-wing split. I would again encourage people to detach from that. Again, also avoiding the kind of anti-Semitism, bringing in anti-Semitism and misusing it in either direction. I think that's incredibly unhelpful. I think anti-Semitism allow the community to have their voice on that issue. But and equally, the same goes for Islamophobia. I just think often we misuse this conflict to kind of have local issues transported in the UK, and we use it as a kind of a proxy war locally. And we've seen a lot in it creating issues between Jews and Muslims. So those are the things I would say to avoid, but as much as you can, support the organizations on the ground. Peace Now, Breaking the Silence, Standing Together are a brilliant organization. I could maybe create a list and send them so they can be circulated, if that's helpful.
That would be interesting. Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
It would. Barclay, I can see you've got your hand up. Do you want to
thank you
ask
very
your
much.
question?
Yeah, I will. It relates a little bit to Adrian's actually, but it's perhaps more widely put. Given that we've got this lurch to the right, inverted commas, in Israel, and with all the dangers that go with it. Number one, is it possible that the Israeli government will actually listen to anybody in the West? And two, what is the best way of influencing Israel excesses now?
So sorry, I missed the end of the second one. The best way of influencing
Israel's policies now.
Okay. I don't have a magical solution. I think it's very, very difficult, and that's why I say to empower Israeli democratic organizations. So again, Standing Together, for example, organization that advocate for policies that affect both Arabs and Haredis, like minimum wage in public transport, etc. And like Breaking the Silence, do so much important work on educating people within Israel about the occupation. So I would really do the research into which organizations, and again, I can send a list. In terms of the Israeli government, will it listen? it's difficult to say, but I think so. I think there is definitely a concern, and they know that the impact of having the far right, and Bibi knows that having the far right in his government is his creation and his biggest problem, because so many international partners have already expressed concern. The problem that we have is that we have seen the rise of the far right in many other countries. And so if Trump returns to America, Trump is not going to care that the far right is in power in Israel, most likely. Many countries are simply not going to care because they also have their own far right issues. Will the Israeli government listen? To an extent. I think the biggest player is going to have to be America, and then Europe tends to follow on from America often, unfortunately. I do think, I know that from working with MPs across the UK, MPs do listen when people speak out and when their inboxes are filled on certain issues, not like by the same person over and over again, but when you organize and MPs get lots of emails on issues, they listen. And it doesn't go unheard, even though sometimes I think it feels like it does. Those conversations are really, really important. Often I find that it really helps us, organizations like us that are advocacy organizations, when we approach MPs, which might not be that interested, if we know that they've had a ton of advocacy from their constituents, it's easier for us to get in the door and then kind of be part of the conversation with them to encourage them to speak out, regardless of what party they're in. Like I said, we work with people across party. In terms of getting any change in Israel, I think truthfully, very limited, other than going through the advocacy of politics and getting MPs to make a difference. And as I said, empower and uplift the voices of Israelis and Palestinians as much as you can.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Can I invite anybody who wants to ask a question to either physically put your hand up if you've got your camera on? We'll try and spot you. I've got two screens to look at, so apologies. Yeah, John Goodman, I can see. Do you want to unmute and fire away?
Yeah, thank you, Danielle. That was terrific insight. Sort of continuing what we've just been talking about, will not the new government increase the clampdown on civil society organizations in Israel that's been going on anyway for the last few years, the organizations that you've been talking about and others? And kind of linked to that, I'm so sort of in awe of the work they do, but I'm also kind of depressed by the fact they don't seem to have much purchase. And you can read liberal Israeli media like Haaretz and agree with everything in it, and then you look at the election results and you think, is anyone listening? You know, it's like I don't know, it's difficult.
Yeah, both good questions. In terms of the clampdown, so I share your concern. I think you're right. I think it's very possible that this government, like the British government, will try and clamp down on freedom of speech and criticism of the Israeli government. It wouldn't be the first time we've had anti-BDS laws passed. We don't support BDS, and I don't support BDS, but I believe in freedom of speech, and we have had laws in the past put through on that. I think the focus is likely going to be on designating Palestinian organizations, as we have already seen, rather than attacking Israeli civil society organizations, but everything is possible. It seems to be like they're more focused on strengthening the police, as in creating more kind of violence. I think also anything that will cause a greater split within Israeli society is going to be to the benefit of the far right. So that's also one to watch for. In terms of making a difference, it's very difficult to measure because my theory, which I wouldn't put money to, is that it's possible that things are getting worse. What I've always said, what I've been saying the past few years, is things are going to get much worse before they get better. And I suspect, as we saw with Bibi, people came to this kind of exhaustion and then came out to the streets to protest him in a mass movement over 2019, 2020. And I think if this government continues to speak against LGBTQ people, women, etc., then we will see an Israeli democratic movement, a civil society movement, respond to that. In terms of whether the human rights organizations make a difference, They do. I think it's difficult to measure. You do see that some of the dialogue change on the left on social media. I think it's interesting that the fact that there has been like the return of the two-state solution conversation with Lapid has been interesting because nobody really wanted to touch it for a while. The biggest one that I've really noticed making a difference to the conversation locally has been Standing Together, who I mentioned, who they're an anti-occupation socialist organization that managed to get Orthodox conservatives to sign a proposed law on the minimum wage. Like that is a really unthinkable for Israel. And so I believe that organizations like that focus on joint struggles are where the future is. And I hope that our political leaders will realize that too and use that to their benefit.
Great, thanks very much. You mentioned the two-state solution coming back into conversation there, Danielle. I'm just wondering, I saw from the Yachad bio that Yachad is looking at an Israeli state alongside an Israeli state. My sense is that there is more and more discussion about the idea of a single secular state between the Jordan and the Med. But obviously, there are a lot of practical difficulties in achieving that. But I'm just wondering what your take on that is, and whether there's any appetite at all for that within either Israel or if you're in touch with Palestinians, or is everybody still? I suppose, well, Israel has its state; they don't need to worry. But
Yeah.
what's your sense of the legitimacy or the support for that initiative, for that idea?
Listen, I do think Palestinians are more likely to say one-state solution because they don't have a state, and so it's a matter for them of stopping the occupation, stopping the siege on Gaza, having full citizenship rights. And so it's easier for an Israeli to say, we'll have two states because we have our state already. And I often say a lot of people who say two-state solution forget to mention the second state, which is Palestine. They already have a support for Israel, which exists. I think, first of all, when we talk about two states, we have to move away from our view of two states from 1995 and Oslo. That's not going to happen anymore. It's going to be a very different two states, and it's going to be a very long process. The occupation is not going to end overnight, and I don't think anyone realistic thinks that. But I can't see, if you look at the level of tension and violence and the constant rounds of war that we're in, if we cannot negotiate two states for two people, I cannot see how we will be able to live in one state side by side. And I'm very much worried that that one state will be closer to Ben Gvir's proposed reality, where Palestinians do not have full rights and are not allowed to control their own education systems, security systems. And so a one state theory worries me far more than a two-state reality where Palestinians are allowed to make their own decisions. Because again, the balance of power will lie with Israelis for as long as we remain in the current situation. And if we are in a one-state reality, which we are approaching, the balance of power will still lie with Israelis. So what is the interest that we have in removing the occupation and giving civil rights to Palestinians? I think two states, from a lot of Israelis even saying this is an uncomfortable thing for people to hear, is that the two states puts the problem away or gets rid of the problem. We don't want to have to continue to manage this, however many Palestinians, for the rest of our lives, and to continue to manage this conflict. So even people in the kind of center will say we need to end the problem of occupation for us, let alone for the Palestinians. So no, I mean, I would welcome any peace negotiation that would come around, but some form of two states for me. Thanks
very much. Bernard, either you had a fly in your left ear or you were wanting to ask a question. You have to unmute though.
Okay. Yes, now that it's impossible, now that it's impossible for Israel to hide, even less possible for Israel to hide the reality of its politics, and that those are likely to be expressed as you're describing in some pretty horrific ways. Do you think that's going to have any impact on the international community, how it views Israel, how it responds to Israel? The ability for those countries to deny the reality of what's going on being less and less. Just wondered what your thoughts about that are.
So I certainly hope so. Like I said, I'm no supporter of BDS. I believe in engagement over boycotts, but I think there has to be a line where we say that people like Ben-Gvir, who was not allowed to serve in Israel's army because he had terrorist associations, should not be someone that we continue business as usual as with because we're friends of Israel. There has to be a line where we say no more. And furthermore, in the kind of plea I've been trying to make to the Jewish communities as friends of Israel is saying that you are abandoning secular Israelis and the kind of average Israeli who you like to portray as the Israel that you love. The LGBTQ marches, Ethiopians, Arabs and Jews playing football together and all that stuff is a great image to put forward. And those people are now going to be abandoned by friends of Israel because this government is against all of that. This is a government that stands against diversity, it stands against equality, it stands against women, it stands against LGBTQ people. So you now can no longer be a friend of Israel with no question marks, because it's letting down a huge proportion of Israelis that so far you have pretended to stand next to. And so I hope that whether it be political leaders, people who donate to Israeli organizations, reconsider how they show their friendship to Israel. To me, support and boost anyone who is fighting for Israeli democracy, and that might be in the form of people like Yair Lapid, who again I know is a centrist and for a lot of left-wing people is less palatable. But those are going to be people who are now going to lead the fight, and the chance that Israel has to remain democratic and Jewish and not Jewish and democratic, which is kind of part of the war at the moment. And so I hope it's going to make a difference. And I know that a lot of Israeli politicians are concerned that the presence of the far right is going to reduce some friendship levels globally, but we shall see.
Thank you very much for that. John Goodman, I can see your second bite at the cherry.
Yeah, second bite at the cherry. But just to follow that up, I'm just thinking about you. I didn't realize the Yachad was in the room at the Board of Deputies. I mean, I'm just wondering, is that going to make it in a way kind of not easier, maybe that's the wrong word, but more acceptable for you to have some of these discussions in circles like that, and for people like us to be able to engage with kind of mainstream Judaism in a way that I've always shied away from in the past, thinking it was a complete waste of time. But they, as you said, they're going to find it much harder to just say Israel, full stop, aren't they? And won't it open up possibilities for some sort of dialogue or pressure in this country as well with those groups?
Yeah, so I mean, so the dialogue around the Board of Deputies, the JLC, etc., is, I very much believe that the Jewish community has to lead that dialogue. It can't come for non-Jews to preach to Jews. I'm uncomfortable about that kind of dynamic, but I think people within the Jewish community, we're going to have a split now, because especially we see young people are very active on this issue. A lot of our supporters and the people that are most engaged with us are young people. I'm sure you saw that the UK proposed an embassy move to Jerusalem. Hundreds of young people spoke out against that to the Board of Deputies, saying, don't do this in our name. So I think that's going to be harder to ignore. I think this isn't just a moment in time where there's election and a government and we say, we're a bit concerned. We're going to see constant news from Israel that's going to be concerning to Jewish people. Because if you have Jewish supremacists in power and you have people who preach anti-Arab hate in the name of the Jewish state, we're not going to be able to, as a community, ignore that. And I think, yeah, there are going to be opportunities. I think the leadership is going to be challenged, but I think the conversation has to be opened. We can't ignore this issue anymore. Lapid is very comfortable for us to work with and ignore the occupation, but this isn't just about occupation anymore. It's such a broader issue. And I think the most telling sign has been, if you saw the two main Jewish newspapers in the UK are the Jewish News and the Jewish Chronicle. The Jewish Chronicle has been quite neutral and kind of said it's a democratic election, so we respect it. But the Jewish News came out very, very impressively and very strongly and said this was our worst fear and it has come true, and what do we do now? And has posed the question to the community. I think that's really, really excellent, and it shows, the Jewish News is a mainstream Jewish newspaper. You can't dismiss it as a left-wing whatever. And so for a mainstream Jewish newspaper to be putting that question forward and saying, we're really worried now, what does this mean about our relationship with Israel, and how do we ignore this problem, is really good. As an Israeli, I appreciate the solidarity as well. And so I think it's going to be a huge challenge for the community. And I think hopefully a lot more Jewish people get involved in the Jewish community and ask the really difficult questions to our leadership.
Good to hear. Thank you for that. Any more hands, any more questions from our audience? You can either digitally raise your hand or physically raise your hand if you've got your camera on. I should be able to see you. Doesn't look like it. Just one I wondered about, Danielle. Forgive me if you did cover this in your intro, but are there many? It's about Arab MKs, basically, Israeli Arab MKs or Palestinian Israelis. There was a time, I've kind of lost track, frankly, but probably 2 or 3 administrations ago now, when there was an Arab party that did have quite some influence on the coalition. I think I'm right in saying, are they just now no longer represented, or are they shrunk, or are they're just outnumbered massively?
So I can do a quick Arab parties brief as well, because there isn't a single Arab voice, and I think that's also really important in Israel. There are Arab Christians, Arab Muslims, Bedouins, Druze, and so on and so forth, as well as people who define themselves as Palestinians, people who define themselves as Arab Israeli. There are so many complex identities in this country, and that's again why I always say don't look at it through a European lens. So the last Israeli government had Ram in it, which is a Arab Muslim party. I wouldn't put it, it's considered left-wing basically because it's Arab, which is hilarious and shows you again how Israeli politics works, but it's not a particularly left-wing party. So Ram was part of the government, and that's the first time an Arab party has ever been part of an Israeli government, which is huge. Their main focus was around getting budgets for Arabs within Israel. They don't really touch on the Palestinian issue every now and then, but their main issue is around Arab communities within Israel and dealing with crime, things like roads, etc. So interestingly, they won't be in the government. There will be no Arab party in the government. They will sit in the opposition. But they actually gained 1 seat, which is quite interesting, because some people thought that because they agreed to work with Jewish Israeli partners, that their voters would lose a lot of voters. And actually, they seem to have gained a seat, which is quite telling. So that's interesting. The other Arab Palestinian party is Hadash Ta'al, led by Ayman Odeh, who some of you might have heard of, and they are a left-wing socialist/communist party. They also remain at 5 seats and will also be part of the opposition party, so they remain in government. And they are more, a lot of the far left Israeli Jews will vote for them, and they are very much kind of socialist. Very much in terms of they talk about Israel, Palestine, believe in Palestinian statehood, oppose the occupation. They're much more vocal on that issue. So I would say that the kind of overall Arab participation in the Knesset in terms of numbers remains the same, but they've moved from having any representation in the government to being in the opposition. And I think that's more than what Palestinians will feel. I think Arabs in Israel will feel that change more of not having representations, worryingly potentially losing out on budgets, violence being dealt with in a more violent way rather than a conciliatory way, etc. So hopefully that answers your question.
That's helpful, yeah, thank you very much. Okay, last call for any more questions. Looking for hands. Okay, I think we're just about done. Is that a hand, Clive, or are you just hovering over your mouse? No. It is a hand. Well, it is a hand, clearly,
actually,
is it?
I was trying to find out where the hand signal was on the iPad here. We haven't talked about the US. Maybe if things get really bad and as bad as we expect in Israel, that could be very upsetting for a lot of Jews in the US. as well as the government, but it's a bit difficult to work out because there's a relationship between the US and Netanyahu. But I just wonder if you have any hopes that the US could be so sort of disgusted by the makeup of the government that they could start making threats.
I hope so. So US Jews are quite interesting because they obviously are more, we know that US, obviously I'm not an American Jew, again, I don't speak for Americans, and American Jews are very much in the camp of the Democrats. They're a very liberal community overall, even though they have Orthodox communities, etc. And they like by a massive like 70+% of American Jews vote Democrat. So that's quite interesting and quite telling. Although American Jewish organizations have come out in statements that have been not that dissimilar to the Board of Deputies or the JLC, which is kind of, we're concerned, but I think they just want to wait and see what happens. In terms of the US, I think, listen, it's going to depend if Trump comes back or not. If we have Trump back in power in the States, then I imagine that Israel will not have a problem here. I think that the US have made it very clear that they are massively concerned about the far right and Itamar Ben-Gvir in Israel. They have said there's been suggestions that they will refuse to work with the far right ministers, which could present some issues if the far right are given ministerial positions tied to security, where we know that there is collaborations between the US and Israel. That will present a challenge, hopefully in a way that I hope it presents a challenge anyway, but it's kind of, well, it depends on the ministerial positions and depends how American politics works. But yeah, the US is the most important player here in terms of challenging, as well as the one other that I didn't mention is everyone's partner to the Abraham Accords. It'll be interesting to see if and how they respond as well, because they will be key players in challenging this government too.
Thank you.
I guess you've been following the US midterm, and they're really very promising from the point of view of Trump not getting back in again.
Promising or not promising?
It is promising for us that he will not get back in again, because it's a very, very bad results for him.
I think they were expecting a sweepstake, and they've kind of mildly won, but it's still unclear because as far as I know, the Republicans have taken the House, but we won't know about the Senate until December, right? I don't. Someone who has better knowledge.
But even given that,
yeah, I'm not an expert in American politics, so I love to talk about it. I think we need to see who is going to be the successor to Biden, and see where they stand on this issue. Frankly, and I think this is part of the challenge we have in the UK too, they have bigger fish to fry than Israel. And so until we have another round of conflict and violence, I don't know how much they're going to want to touch this issue. But I suspect the Democrats are going to want to distance themselves from the far right in any case.
Thanks.
Biden's already indicated that, hasn't he? Adrian, you've got a hand up.
Yes. How do organisations like yours perceive what's happening here in terms of are we seen is the UK seen as comfortably supporting the Israeli government? Obviously, there's major military transfers from this country to Israel, or are people in Israel aware of things like Palestine Action, which has had a really successful continuing campaign against Elbit, and the kind of things that organisations like ours is trying to do to promote BDS and so on?
So how the UK is perceived. So I think the problem is that the UK government if you look at the Conservative and Labour statements on Israel, a lot of them are not that different. They support two-state solution, they oppose settlement expansion, but they don't. The question is what they actually do about that, other than putting out statements. And so I think this is where I say, if you're a friend to Israel, you have to be a challenging friend to Israel too. And the people in power have to use their power and their voices to influence. And it's when they can. I do think it's going to be more challenging with this government, but that's where I would say the UK too often is a silent friend of Israel, where it could be a more helpful friend. I think in terms of pro-Palestine organizations, I'll be very honest and blunt, is most Israelis, except from very left-wing Israelis or Israelis who are very engaged in the conversation on occupation, most Israelis do, the vast majority of Israelis, first of all, oppose BDS, as do the vast majority of British Jews. And the vast majority of Israelis don't see, they see a lot of pro-Palestine organizations and pro-Palestine discussions as anti-Israel. And I think that's part of the problem, is the dialogue is very much, you're either pro-Israel or anti-Israel, you're either pro-Palestine or anti-Palestine. And so the conversation abroad is often not constructive, and often kind of targets the wrong people, to the extent that I know that some far left groups might boycott the Israeli Labour Party or Israeli Meretz, and I don't think those are helpful people to target when those actually are some of your partners on the ground, even if you don't align or agree with everything that they say or do. And so that creates a real barrier for engagement with some movements. And so people are not that aware. I think people here overall, I know Israelis do experience often also racism abroad, and so that taints their view of how Europe talks about Israel-Palestine. But I think the main thing would be in kind of, like I said, partnership with people working on the ground and uplifting their voices as much as possible and letting them lead the conversation.
Thank you.
And we'd welcome your offer of a list of sort of progressive organisations. Would be really useful, actually.
Yeah, I can send that.
I'm going to abuse my position as moderator now, just to ask one final question, and then I think we'll need to wind up, which is just these extreme right, the three mini parties that are the Jewish religious, the religious Zionist party, does their racism extend to Falasha, for example, or Jewish Israelis of Sephardic or Arab descent, let's say?
No, so that's that's a very good question. So often the right wing, including the Likud, claim to speak for Mizrahi, so Jews of Arab origin like myself. So my family, for example, comes from Yemen originally and come from quite a poor background, and they mostly are Likud voters, historically always have been, and that's actually quite common. So their racism, I think, structurally does, but actively no. They very much claim to kind of empower the weaker sides of Israeli Jewish society. The focus is on Arabs and Palestinians and Muslims, but also with the religious Zionist party, there's a strong history of preventing Jews from marrying non-Jews. That's also an element which goes beyond Arabs and Palestinians.
Thanks very much. Okay, I think we'll draw things to a close there. So we should all give a virtual round of applause to Danielle for a sterling effort there. Really, really full and frank exchange of info and some really interesting insights. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.
You're most welcome. Quick plug for our next couple of events. We have our next vigil a week on Saturday, so the 19th of November, outside the town hall, 11 till 12. Be there if you can. It's well, it's a good chance to catch up. That's not really what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to engage with the public, which we do. We always catch, 2 or 3 new recruits, passers by, fascinating people. And then the other thing we're doing a bit more direct action, which we don't normally do, but another demo outside Barclays Bank on the 3rd of December, noon till 1 p.m, trying to engage with customers or people going into the branch to, Belinda, am I getting the date wrong?
Yeah, no, sorry, Andy. We were going for the 3rd of December, but then after we'd fixed
It's
that,
been moved, National
War on
Day,
Want
right,
and
okay.
Palestine Solidarity Campaign moved it to the week, the 26th. I'll put that
Oh.
all out in a mailing this week together with the information from Danielle. So it's
Okay, 26th of
vigil
November.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much.
So it's a week earlier than we'd originally agreed.
So that's the next 2 weekends sorted out then. Yeah,
Absolutely.
super. Okay, thanks very much indeed, everybody, for your time and patience. The recording will post onto YouTube over the weekend. So if you liked it so much you want to catch it again, you can do so, or share it with your friends. Thank you very much, Danielle, and good evening to you all. Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Aye.
Everybody.
I think nearly.
Bye.
Danielle.